Most people will never notice it happening. It moves quietly, beneath the surface of everyday life, woven into the fabric of how they speak, how they behave, how they justify themselves to the world. There is a pattern, ancient, deeply rooted, almost invisible, that governs the inner lives of millions of people without their awareness. It is the compulsive need to be right in the eyes of others. Not just understood, not just accepted, but approved of, validated, seen as good enough. This is not a minor habit. It is a complete orientation of the self, a way of existing that places the opinions of others at the very center of one's reality. And according to Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most profound thinkers in the history of psychology, this orientation is not a personality type, it is a wound. A wound so old, so familiar, that the person carrying it has long since stopped recognizing it as pain. They simply believe this is who they are. They believe that their worth depends on what others think, and so they spend their lives, day after day, performing a kind of invisible labor, managing perceptions, softening edges, adapting, shrinking, explaining, always explaining. Jung observed that this compulsion, this constant need to convince others, to justify oneself, to seek approval, reveals something terrifying about the state of the inner world. When a person cannot act without first securing the understanding of those around them, they have, in the deepest sense, abandoned themselves. They are no longer living from the inside out, they are living from the outside in, building their identity from the reflections they receive from others, rather than from any stable, rooted sense of self. And this, Jung warned, is one of the most dangerous conditions a human being can inhabit. Because it is a condition that looks, from the outside, entirely normal, even admirable. We reward people who explain themselves. We praise those who are considerate, diplomatic, careful with others' feelings. We call them emotionally mature. But Jung saw beneath this surface. He recognized that behind every unnecessary justification, behind every moment of emotional over-explanation, there lies a deeper truth. The person does not believe they have the right to exist on their own terms. They are asking, in every conversation, for permission to be who they are. To understand where this wound comes from, we must travel backwards, not into philosophy or theory, but into the earliest experiences of childhood, into the rooms where identity is first formed and where the foundations of self-worth are either built or broken. When a child is raised in an environment where their emotional reality is consistently dismissed, something catastrophic happens inside them. Not catastrophic in the dramatic sense, no single explosive moment, rather a slow, quiet collapse of inner trust. The child cries and is told they are being dramatic. The child feels afraid and is met with ridicule. The child feels sad and hears the words, "There is nothing to be sad about." Each time this happens, the message is the same. What you feel is not real. What you feel is not acceptable. What you feel is wrong. Jung described this process as emotional invalidation, and he understood it as one of the primary sources of psychological fragmentation. When the child's inner experience is repeatedly denied or minimized by the adults around them, they learn a devastating lesson. Their own feelings cannot be trusted. Only the reactions of others can tell them whether their experience is legitimate, and so they begin to look outward, compulsively, for confirmation that what they feel is real. This is the birth of the pattern. Not a decision, not a character flaw, a survival adaptation. The child discovers that if they can explain themselves well enough, if they can justify their tears, their anger, their fears in a way that makes sense to the adults around them, they may escape punishment, rejection, or withdrawal of love. Explanation becomes armor. Justification becomes the price of emotional safety. And by the time this child grows into an adult, the pattern is so deeply embedded that it no longer feels like a coping mechanism. It simply feels like who they are. But here is what Jung understood with rare clarity. This pattern, though it feels like connection, is actually a form of profound disconnection. Because every act of compulsive self-explanation is, at its core, an act of distrust. Distrust of one's own reality, distrust of one's own worth, distrust of the idea that one's existence requires no justification at all. The compulsive explainer is not seeking understanding, they are seeking permission. And the tragedy is that no matter how much understanding they receive, it is never enough, because the wound is not in the relationship. The wound is inside. There is a name for what happens when a person organizes their entire inner life around the approval of others. Jung called it the loss of internal authority, and it is, perhaps, the most common and most devastating form of self-abandonment in the modern world. Internal authority is not arrogance. It is not the refusal to listen, the hardening of the heart, or the dismissal of others' perspectives. It is something far more elemental. It is the capacity to trust your own experience as real, to know what you feel, believe what you observe, and hold your ground without requiring the validation of those around you to confirm that you are sane. It is the ability to say in the silence of your own mind, "This is true for me," and to mean it fully, without immediately scanning the faces of others to see whether they agree. When this authority is missing, life becomes a kind of endless performance. Every decision must be justified, every emotion must be explained, every choice must be presented in a way that preempts criticism and invites understanding. The person is exhausted, not by life itself, but by the labor of constantly managing how life appears to others. They shape their words before speaking them. They monitor their behavior before performing it. They feel what they feel, and then immediately translate that feeling into language that others might find acceptable. Jung described this as the ego becoming separated from the self, the individual's conscious identity losing contact with the deeper, truer center of who they are. And when this separation occurs, something subtle but devastating follows. The person stops making choices based on what they actually want or believe, and starts making choices based on what is most likely to be approved. They stop living, they start performing. This is the high cost of seeking approval. Not social awkwardness, not surface-level discomfort, but the gradual erosion of an authentic life. The person who cannot trust themselves becomes, over time, a stranger to themselves. They look in the mirror and see a face they recognize but do not know. They cannot answer the simplest questions. What do I want? What do I believe? What would I do if no one were watching? Because those questions require an inner voice, and the inner voice has been drowned out for so long by the noise of external opinion that it has become almost impossible to hear. Jung's concept of individuation is, at its heart, a process of recovery. Not recovery from illness, but recovery of self, the slow, often painful journey back to the one who was there before the world began to demand justification. And central to this journey is the development of something most people have never been taught to build, the capacity to disappoint. This sounds strange, perhaps even frightening, but Jung was unequivocal. There is no psychological freedom without the willingness to be misunderstood. As long as a person arranges their inner and outer life to avoid the discomfort of others' disapproval, they remain imprisoned, not by anyone else's will, but by their own terror. The true work of individuation begins precisely at the point where the individual chooses their own truth over others' comfort, where they say no without explaining why, where they change their mind without apologizing for it, where they end a conversation, leave a room, or make a choice, and do so without the compulsive urge to justify, clarify, or manage the perception of those watching. This is not easy. The fear is real. The fear of abandonment is perhaps the oldest fear a human being can carry. It dates to infancy, to the primal terror of being left alone, unloved, unseen. And for those who grew up in environments where love was conditional on performance, on compliance, on being acceptable, this fear is not an abstraction. It is a physical reality. The body tenses, the throat tightens, the mind races through explanations, apologies, softening phrases, anything to close the gap, anything to restore the approval that has suddenly been placed at risk. But Jung was clear about what is on the other side of this fear. Not more isolation, not rejection, but self. Because it is precisely in the moment when you choose your own truth over another person's comfort that you begin to exist as a whole person, rather than as a managed reflection of what others want to see. The silence that follows, the refusal to explain, the willingness to be misunderstood is not absence. It is the first expression of genuine presence. It is the moment the self says, "I am here, and I do not require your permission to be." When someone stops explaining themselves, the world around them changes. Not gradually, radically, and not always comfortably. The people who were accustomed to your insecurity, who had built their relationship with you on the foundation of your need for their approval, begin to feel the ground shift beneath them. Manipulative people in particular feel this most acutely, because manipulation is not possible without a cooperating wound. It requires a specific vulnerability, the fear of disapproval, the terror of being abandoned, the desperate need to be understood. When that vulnerability is no longer on offer, the manipulation has no surface to grip. It slides off, and this is disorienting for those who depended on it. Jung observed this dynamic with great insight. He recognized that many human relationships are not built on mutual respect and genuine encounter, but on unconscious power arrangements in which one person's insecurity feeds another person's need for control. The compulsive self-explainer in this arrangement is always slightly in debt, always slightly guilty, always slightly in need of forgiveness, understanding, or permission. And the person across from them, whether they are aware of it or not, occupies the position of judge, the one who decides whether the explanation is sufficient, whether the feelings are legitimate, whether the behavior was acceptable. When the self-explainer stops explaining, this arrangement collapses. The judge has no case to rule on, the power dynamic dissolves, and what remains is a confrontation, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes liberating, with the actual nature of the relationship. Is there genuine respect here? Genuine care? Or was the relationship held together entirely by one person's willingness to seek approval and another's willingness to grant or withhold it? This is why silence, real silence, the silence that comes from internal authority rather than avoidance, is so powerfully transformative. It does not merely change a behavior, It changes the entire relational field. It reveals what was always true, but never visible, because the compulsive explanation was always filling the space, smoothing the edges, maintaining the illusion of harmony. When the explanation stops, the truth speaks. And truth, as Jung never tired of reminding us, is the only foundation on which a real life can be built. The journey toward internal authority is not completed in a single moment of decision. It is not the result of a breakthrough, a revelation, or a dramatic confrontation with the past. It is instead a practice, quiet, daily, often unglamorous. It is the practice of returning again and again to your own experience as the primary source of truth about your life. It begins with noticing. Before any change is possible, the person must first see the pattern, must catch themselves in the act of unnecessary justification, and recognize it not as politeness or empathy, but as fear dressed in the clothing of consideration. This is the first act of internal authority, to see clearly what you have been doing and to understand why. Not to judge it, not to punish yourself for it, but to see it with the compassionate clarity of someone who is finally willing to face the truth. Then comes the pause, the space between the impulse to explain and the act of explanation. In that space, even if it lasts only a few seconds, something new becomes possible. The person can ask themselves, am I speaking because this needs to be said? Or am I speaking because I am afraid of what happens if I don't? This question, asked honestly and repeatedly, begins to dismantle the automaticity of the pattern. It introduces a measure of conscious choice into a process that had previously been entirely unconscious. And then, gradually, comes the willingness to remain in discomfort, to allow the silence after a decision, to allow the awkwardness of a boundary that was not explained, to allow others to feel confused or even hurt without rushing to resolve that confusion with an apology or a justification. This willingness to be misunderstood and remain whole is the very heart of what Jung meant by individuation. It is the moment when the person stops asking the world to validate their existence and begins instead to validate it themselves. This is not the end of the journey. There is no end. Individuation is not a destination, but a direction, a continuous movement toward greater wholeness, greater honesty, greater courage. But there comes a point in this movement when the person notices something remarkable. The exhaustion has lifted. The endless labor of managing others' perceptions has stopped. There is energy now, energy that was always there but was being consumed entirely by the performance of acceptability, and that energy is available for something else, for creation, for genuine relationship, for the quiet, radical act of living a life that is actually one's own. Jung believed that this was the deepest purpose of psychological work, not adjustment, not adaptation, not the smoothing of difficult edges, but the restoration of the individual to their own life. The moment when a person stops being a character in someone else's narrative and becomes the author of their own. When they no longer need to explain themselves to exist. When silence becomes not an absence, but a declaration. When they can look at the world, at all of its pressure, its expectation, its demand for justification, and know, quietly and completely, that they owe it nothing except their truth. And their truth is enough.